Discussions of racism usually fix, by the way, they usually fix on attitudes. They're almost always focused on attitudes. Why do people feel that way? But we ought to keep in mind that the larger system of power and interest sustains racist attitudes. So we talk not only of attitudinal racism, we also talk about institutional racism. And what I'm asking also that we talk about is structural or systemic racism. In modern-day capitalist society, racism serves a number of systemic functions. First, employers have always desired a surplus workforce. When there's full employment, when jobs go looking for workers, pay goes up. When pay goes up, you cut into profit margins. But when workers are in superabundant supply in an overcrowded job market, then wages can be kept down. For generations, and the way to keep wages down and have that oversupply is to have what Marx called the reserve army of labor. And for generations, women, children, immigrants served in that reserve army of labor, increasing the competition for jobs and depressing wages, and so too have people of color. By keeping African Americans and Latinos in this kind of ethnically delineated underclass, racism can secure that reserve army. Bush is criticized for doing nothing for the economy. And it might seem so given our enormous problems. And I think of what Cardinal Richelieu said over 300 years ago. Cardinal Richelieu said, "The power to do nothing is great, but it must not be abused." Yet I would suggest that Bush is doing exactly what he wants to do according to his class interests. Free trade, recession. He doesn't get around to a job program because he doesn't want a job program. He's leading in the way he wants to lead. That's his dilemma. Otherwise he could start doing all these things and win votes and all that sort of thing. That's not what he wants to represent. Another function of racism is by keeping a permanent underclass that's who does the dirty work of society, the toughest, mindless, lowest paying jobs. So what you have is, rather than the normal rate of exploitation, you have what some theorists call super exploitation, which allows the investor to accumulate wealth at an even greater rate of return on an especially disadvantaged sector of the workforce. The same conditions, as I said before, of super exploitation obtained in the third world, which is why they want free trade, to get themselves open, to have access to the Mexican labor market. Racism, by the way, also helps keep the working class fragmented and disorganized. The owners and bosses are safest when the workers are busy fighting each other for crumbs rather than uniting for a larger slice of the pie. And by the way, economic elites are aware of this and they consciously propagate this. Oh, what do you have, a conspiracy theory, Parenti? Here we go again, No, I don't have a conspiracy theory. George Bush ran those Willie Horton ads as a way of bringing us together. George Bush harps and attacks affirmative action and quotas and inner-city crime. He does those things to bring us together. Yes, they consciously do that. And you want to call that conspiracy? Call it conspiracy. I don't know what you mean by conspiracy. They consciously pursue their interests, just as other people might. The minute you ascribe human agency to the elite elements in society, someone considers you propagator of conspiracy theory. By the way, rulers have always done that. The Habsburg Empire played off one nationality against another. That's how it survived through right up until 1914 or whatever. Plato and Aristotle stressed the desirability. Plato in his laws, Aristotle in politics, stressed the desirability of importing slaves of different nationalities and languages as a necessary means of preventing them from getting together in rebellion. Aristotle, quote, "The husbandmen should all, by all means, be slaves, but not of the same nation, for thus they would be laborious in their business and safe from attempting any novelties." European invaders of Africa and North America used bribes, deceptions, threats, gifts of firearms to play off tribes against tribes. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy actuality. In 17th century America, you got a very interesting development. Indentured white servants and and African slaves got together. In many instances there was coalescence. They socially, they often planned together, they often went into uprisings together. And this terrified the slaveholders. Laws were passed prohibiting any interracial mixing, which is evidence of the fact that there was interracial mixing. When you've got to pass a law to prohibit it, that means it's going on. They feared that the white indentured servants would join the blacks or the Indians, which, by the way, happened. Blacks and Indians came together. Sometimes whites and Indians or blacks, or sometimes all three groups in these kinds of uprisings. Desperate, poor people who were totally, terribly super exploited. The colonial governments in the 17th century and into the 18th century had a conscious policy of playing off these groups, turning Indians against blacks and turning poor whites against both. They consciously pursued that policy. In the postbellum era, the Ku Klux Klan was used by bosses to terrorize labor combinations and keep whites and blacks at odds. The Klan, by the way, the Klan in the post-Civil War era was not made up of Bubba and Joe Redneck. The early personnel in the Klan were merchants, landowners, bankers, all sorts of odd people that you wouldn't expect riding around at night with a bed sheet on. That was the property classes, store owners, people like this, small investors, big investors. They were the ones who got together and started to terrorize. In fact, initially terrorizing both poor whites and blacks to keep them apart. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, oil and mining companies in this country consciously promoted disunity and hostility among immigrant groups in the company towns. They even went so far as to mix the work teams, nationalities. One Swede, a Pole, a Hungarian, and Irish, just exactly in the way that Aristotle had advised. Not that they had read Aristotle, they were just pursuing the same, they were just responding to the same material and class interests. In U.S. prisons, officials have consciously promoted friction between white and black inmates, doing everything to discourage unity. The same strategy with urban police forces, with street gangs. When the Crips and the Bloods signed that truce, that day I said the police are going to try to do everything they can to instigate. And by the way, that's true. KPFA had a special report on that, how the police are deliberately trying to provoke and instigate conflicts between the Crips and the Bloods. I remember the report vividly. My son Christian Parenti did it. I just Thank you. It's just fatherly pride there I had to stick in. Racism also serves as a very good, by the way, very good cultural issue, quote, a non-class issue of right-wing leaders. They're always on the lookout for non-class issues. They're always on the lookout for non-economic issues to try to win allegiance from people who have no common interest with them. Pornography in the arts, abortion, to split the working class on that, especially the Catholic Democratic vote, busing, affirmative action, quotas, flag burning, prayers in the school, all these kind of things. The new hottest one they got now is too much litigation, too many trial lawyers. You've seen that? That's really going to set everybody on fire. Tell that to an unemployed steel worker, huh? But inciting them, being able to cut through, and racism, of course, does that. So racism is usually seen as an aberrant, grotesque offshoot from what is a basically rational society. What I'm arguing here is the other way around. It's a rational output from a basically aberrant and distorted society. Much of politics involves the rational manipulation of irrational symbols. And just because those symbols are manipulated irrationally, it doesn't mean that the people who are manipulating them don't know what they're doing. It's the same with anti-communism, it's the same with the super-patriotism, it's the same with use of wars and jingoism and the demonization of foreign leaders.